Why I stopped reading fantasy books, and you probably do too. Now, I'm not an author, I'm just a reader, and even though I very rarely DNF books, there are certain things in fantasy stories that quietly kill my interest. Now, to be clear, some of my all-time favorite books do have one or two of these flaws I'm going to mention in this video, because obviously, no story is perfect. But when many of these things pile up, or they're just too in your face, that's when I usually lose interest in continuing a series. So in this video, I want to talk about the reasons why I stopped reading fantasy books, and maybe you do too. So let's get into it. Number one, it feels like homework. So it feels like there's a point where fantasy books becomes less about being immersed and more about like trying to do homework. Like you're juggling complex politics, 20 different POVs, 3 different calendars, and maybe a glossary of invented terms just to follow the plot. And when that happens, even a good story can start to feel like homework. A great example, and if you watch my channel, you know how often I do mention it, but it is Malazan. Now, I tried reading Malazan twice now, and I want to love it. People whose taste I really respect absolutely swear by the series, but both times I've just found myself absolutely overwhelmed by how much work it takes just to understand what's going on. And what I often have found so surprising is that there's like this whole PowerPoint on Reddit that so many people will point to as a good resource to read while going through Malazan. So this is basically a PowerPoint that summarizes each chapter in great detail, and I remember on my first read of Guardians of the Moon, I was reading Guardians of the Moon and then going to this PowerPoint to try and understand what I was reading, and if I'm honest, it was honestly one of the biggest turn-off ever. Now, the second time I tried reading Malazan, I just went with the flow, which a lot of people then also say you just need to go with the flow, and I still struggled. That being said, I don't always mind over-explaining something. Like, for example, the Dandelion Dynasty definitely has sections that go way too much into detail. You know, how boats are built, or political structures, or giving you historical context, but for some reason, that series, it just works for me. Now, I've sometimes said that the Dandelion Dynasty almost feels like a Malazan Light series, so I might be ready now to actually try Malazan once again. 2. Flat or unlikable characters. So for me, characters are literally at the heart of any story. I often can forgive clunky prose or slow pacing or even the occasional lore dump, but if I do not care about the people at the center of it, it's almost impossible for me to stay invested in the story. Now, one book that really stood out in the wrong way was The Star King by Jack Vance. I gave that book 1 star simply because every character felt like a cardboard cutout, so like bland and emotionless. I just really did not feel any connection, and I didn't feel any tension or any spark to any of these characters. And when that happens, even if the world is imaginative, the plot is technically clever, I just cannot bring myself to care. That said, this isn't a hard rule. There are obviously exceptions. Now, one of my all-time favorite books, The Three-Body Problem, absolutely has what I would call flat characters. In most ways, they're quite distant and emotionally cold, and they often feel more like vehicles for ideas than real people. But in that case, the concepts were so brilliant, themes so big and ambitions that it didn't matter as much, because I wasn't reading this story for that emotional connection, but rather I was reading it to have my, brain lit on fire. But most of the time, characters are what keep me turning the page. You can build literally the coolest magic system in the world, but if I don't care who's using it, I'm not going to stick around. Number 3, bad dialogue. Now, nothing pulls me out of a fantasy story faster than awkward, unnatural dialogue. You know, when every character talks in the same voice, or worse, when they all sound like they're delivering these weird punchlines that you would maybe see on social media or something, or they say things that no one would actually ever say in real life, that can completely break my immersion. Now, one of the worst examples I've ever read, and I don't think anyone of you would even have heard about this book, but that was a book called Rejected by My Fated Mate by Margaret R. Newell. So I picked up that book for my Reading Books with No Reviews challenge, and simply put, I wish I hadn't read that book. The dialogue was honestly some of the most cringe-inducing I've ever encountered. It was so stiff and melodramatic and just completely divorced from how real people, or even how people in fantasy worlds actually talk. It just made the entire reading experience feel like almost like a parody, and not in a good way. Now, on the more maybe controversial side, I have to mention Mistborn Era 2. Now, I love Brandon Sanderson, and you know that if you watch my channel, he is one of my favorite authors, but I've actually always struggled a bit with his dialogue, especially in Mistborn Era 2. The humor, I feel, just often leans more towards the childish than clever, and characters will sometimes almost break the tone completely just to crack a joke. I do do know that a lot of readers actually love the banter in Mistborn Era 2 and do find it charming, but for me, it just sometimes really undermines the emotional weight of the story. Of course, humor and tone are incredibly subjective, but when dialogue doesn't reveal character, or worse, actually flattens out the characters, it just becomes one more reason for me to quietly stop turning the pages. 4. Nothing happens for ages. So let me make it clear, I do not mind a slow start to a book. I actually don't even mind a book that takes its time to build atmosphere or lay the groundwork for a bigger story. But at some point, something needs to happen or I really will start to wonder why I'm still reading. And I think the ultimate example of this for me is Crossroads of Twilight by Robert Jordan, book 10 in the Wheel of Time. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say it felt like nothing happened for 800 pages in that book. The pacing was just so dreadfully slow. Characters literally just moved from place to place, had internal monologues, and then the book ended. The only reason why I didn't DNF the whole series right there was because of my sheer stubbornness and because many readers told me that book 11 to 14 actually picks up. Spoiler, it does. But man, book 10 was just so painful. Number 5. The book becomes too preachy. So I love books that actually explore deep themes, you know, like power or identity or faith or morality, because when a fantasy novel has something to say and says it well, it actually usually becomes an instant favorite for me. But the key here is being subtle. Usually I want to work for the theme a little. I want the themes to be woven into the fabric of the story, revealed through the characters or the world building or the conflict, not just stated outright like maybe a TED talk in disguise, you know. So one book that I actually did enjoy overall and I gave it 4 stars, but really struggled with one particular element of the story was Blood Over Bright Haven. So this book starts incredibly strong. The first 2 chapters are just amazing, but by the midway point it became very clear what the author wanted me to take away. The author was very clear that they wanted me to take away the story was about oppression or the dangers of institutional religion or power as a tool for control. It was all there in the story, and yes, all really valid themes, but in my opinion, it was just delivered with such a heavy hand that the nuance just disappeared a bit. At times, it almost felt like it stopped being a story and started feeling a bit more like a lecture. Usually it's not that the fact that I disagree with the ideas that I read about, it's just that if they are too in your face and just too preachy, I just don't enjoy it. Number 6. Too many POVs too soon. Now some fantasy books, they just throw you straight into 5 or 6 or 30 different POVs within the first few chapters, and for me, that's often where the connection starts to break a bit for me. You know, when every single new chapter shifts to a new character in a new location with a new tone and a brand new set of stakes, it can become a bit exhausting because I'm simply just not invested in the story yet. I haven't had time to care about anyone before being asked to care about someone else. And probably, again, the clearest example, and I know someone's gonna roll their eyes right now, but I have to mention again, Malazan. I've already mentioned how Guardians of the Moon just felt overwhelming in terms of world building, but the thing is here is that the number of POVs is a big part of why I struggle to connect with the story. I think the first book alone has something like 30 plus different POVs. I just found it nearly impossible to get emotionally grounded in any of the characters since there are just too many. But let me give you another example here. So I would also say The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. There's a lot of things that I really enjoyed about it, but what held it back from becoming a new favorite for me was just how busy the plot felt. I felt we were jumping between so many characters, and while most of them were super interesting, I just found myself wanting to stay with them for a bit longer rather than constantly shifting perspectives. That being said, I do generally love multiple POV stories. I just usually prefer them not to be too overwhelming. Number 7. Deus Ex Machina saves the day. So I obviously love fantasy that surprises me, but there is a clear difference between a clever twist and a sudden unexplained save that feels like the author just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. And that is the classic Deus Ex Machina. You know, when the story sets up impossible stakes and then resolves them with something that hasn't been earned. Now, an example that really stood out for me, despite I actually love this whole series overall, was the Child trilogy by R.J. Barker. So that trilogy is actually genuinely one of the most unique and atmospheric fantasy trilogies I've ever read, and I actually think most of my viewers would actually love it if they're looking for something different. But when I got to the ending, ending, so the very last chapter, it just felt like the author had kind of written himself into a corner, and the final resolution just involved, in my opinion, a completely new world-building mechanic that hadn't been part of the story before. While I still love that series, I think that last-minute development here just made the ending feel less satisfying than it could have been. And of course, we have the classic example, the eagles in Lord of the Rings. Now just hear me out before you go crazy here, okay? People often cite this as an example because Frodo and Sam were stranded on Mount Doom, and just as everything seems hopeless, the eagles just suddenly show up to rescue them. And if you Google it, a lot of people say that this is probably one of the most famous Deus Ex Machina moments in all of literature. Now, as much as I've talked about the things that push me away from fantasy books, I think it's important to say not every book that I stop reading is a bad book, and not every book that you love has to be universally praised to be valid either. Sometimes it's just a matter of taste, or it can be mood, or it can even be timing. A book might not click with me today, but if I picked it up in a year's time from now, I might actually love it. Or I might never love it, and that's okay too. I think in the book community we often treat DNFing a book or deciding not to continue a series as almost a kind of failure, like we missed something or didn't try hard enough. But really, reading isn't a test, and it's not supposed to feel or make you feel guilty. It's supposed to be, you know, something that brings you joy or curiosity or gives you a sense of connection. And part of that is recognizing that actually you are allowed to bounce off of things. Simply put, humans, we just have too limited time, and there are just too many amazing stories out there for you to spend it forcing yourself through one that just didn't speak to you. Now, if you want to know 7 world building mistakes that ruin fantasy worlds, check out this video.